After rescuing young Chloe from a kidnapper, following a suspicious encounter at Walmart that led to a tense confrontation at a gas station, veteran Rick Dawson and his wife, Margaret, hoped their brief but terrifying brush with violence was over. The little girl's parents were deeply grateful to Rick for saving their daughter's life and welcomed the elderly couple with open hearts, eager to show their appreciation. Little did they know that the true reason behind Chloe's abduction was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Not even Rick's years of military service could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. Before we dive into part 2 of this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. Rick Dawson, a veteran in his late 60s, stepped out of the police interview room, the weight of the day's events heavy on his shoulders. What had started as a simple morning trip to Walmart, just a quick grocery run and a stop at the pharmacy, had taken an unimaginable turn. Now, hours later, he stood in the Laredo Police Department, having played a crucial role in foiling a kidnapping attempt. As Rick entered the waiting area, his eyes instinctively searched for his wife, Margaret. He spotted her in conversation with a small group, the Parker family, including both parents and their daughter, Chloe, along with the school principal and a staff member. Relief flickered across Margaret's face when she saw him, but concern still lingered in her eyes. Ignoring the fatigue that started creeping in his limbs, he made his way over to join them, each step a reminder of the long and unexpected day he had endured. As he approached, he caught snippets of their conversation. The parents and the school principal were deep in discussion about school security measures following the incident, their voices urgent and concerned. "Need to ensure nothing like this ever happens again," Mr. Parker was saying, his arm protectively around his daughter's shoulders. The principal, a tall woman with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, nodded emphatically. "I assure you, Mr. and Mrs. Parker, we take the safety of our students very seriously. I will be proposing several new security measures to the board immediately." Rick joined the group, standing beside Margaret. She gave him a small smile, reaching out to squeeze his hand briefly. He returned the gesture, grateful for her steady presence. The principal continued, outlining her plans. "We're looking at implementing a mobile app alert and a barcode system for drop-offs and pickups. The mobile app will include live tracking for students taking the school bus and notifications if a child exits the school area." Mrs. Parker, her face still pale from the day's ordeal, looked interested. "That sounds like a good start. How soon could something like that be put in place?" The principal's expression turned apologetic. "It will take some time to discuss with the board and have the system set up. In the meantime, we'll be strengthening our security presence and increasing staff during drop-off and pick-up hours." The Parkers nodded, though Rick could see the lingering worry in their eyes. He understood their concern all too well. After what had nearly happened to their daughter, it would take time for them to feel secure again. Just then, an officer approached the group. Everyone turned to face him, the conversation dying down as they waited to hear what he had to say. "We've processed all of your statements," the officer began, his voice professional but not unkind. "Everything seems to be consistent with what we've gathered so far." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "I should inform you that we've found some disturbing evidence on the suspect's phone. There are photos of Chloe at school, at your home, and with your family. We also found a note with detailed records of your routine schedules, when you go to and return from work, your weekend habits, even Chloe's private music lessons at home." Evelyn Parker, Chloe's mother, gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What does this mean? Are we safe?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Roy Parker, Chloe's father, added, "Has he confessed anything?" "What did he say?" The officer held up a hand, trying to calm their fears. "The suspect, Carlos Ortiz, has refused to speak so far. He's exercising his right to remain silent. We'll be pressing him for more information tomorrow." He continued, his voice taking on a reassuring tone. "You don't have to worry anymore. Based on the evidence we've gathered, Ortiz will most likely face life in prison for this. From what we can tell, your daughter was probably chosen as an easy target. We don't believe you're in any further danger." Rick, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Officer, if I may, Carlos Ortiz was about to take the girl across the border. Wouldn't he need false documents to make that possible, especially since he already had multiple IDs himself? Could there be other accomplices involved?" The officer nodded, acknowledging Rick's point. "You're right to consider that possibility, sir. It's true that he might have bought those false identities. However, at this point, we haven't found any evidence of accomplices. There are no suspicious texts or calls from his phone to other numbers or persons." He paused, then added, "In fact, we didn't find any false documents prepared for Chloe. Our current theory is that he was planning to hide her in the trunk of his car to cross the border. That's likely why he drugged her. At this point, all evidence suggests Ortiz was acting alone." As the group prepared to leave, the officer spoke up again. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker, for tonight, I'd strongly advise against returning to your home. We can provide accommodation at a safe shelter, or if you prefer, there are plenty of hotels in the area. It's just a precaution to ensure your safety for the next few days." Evelyn nodded, her face etched with worry. "I don't think I'd feel safe at home right now, knowing that man had all our routines and schedules." Roy agreed, then turned to the officer. "My brother owns an apartment here in Laredo. He offered it to us earlier when I called him. We visited there once about 5 years ago, so there's no way Ortiz or anyone else would know about it. I think we'd feel safe there tonight." He gave the officer the address, La Contessa apartment. Rick's eyebrows raised slightly at the mention of the high-end luxury apartment complex. It was clear the Parker family was quite wealthy, which suddenly made Ortiz's targeting of them make more sense. The principal, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Chloe, dear, don't worry about school for the next few weeks. Take all the time you need to rest and recover." She turned to the Parkers. "We can send her schoolwork to you if you'd like, or even arrange for a private tutor or online sessions. But if Chloe prefers to take a complete break, that won't be a problem either. Whatever works best for you." Evelyn thanked her, promising to let her know their decision the following day. The school staff member beside the principal diligently noted down everything, her pen scratching quietly against a notepad. As the group began to disperse, Roy turned to Rick and Margaret. "We'd very much like to invite you both for dinner to thank you properly," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "But given the circumstances, it's just not possible tonight. We need to get settled at the apartment first." Evelyn, overhearing her husband, chimed in. "Why don't you come to the apartment tomorrow for lunch? There's a pool and we can relax and talk while Chloe swims. She's such an outgoing child, and I'm worried she'll get bored quickly if she's not in school." She paused, then added warmly, "In fact, why don't you bring your grandchild that you mentioned earlier?" "If that's possible, of course. If not, just the two of you would be wonderful." Rick and Margaret exchanged a glance, considering the offer. After a moment, Rick spoke. "That sounds like a lovely idea. We're not sure about our grandchild. They live quite far from here, but Margaret and I would be delighted to join you for lunch tomorrow." He smiled, adding, "After everything that's happened, it's probably good for all of us to stay together. It helps not to carry the burden alone." Roy nodded gratefully, pulling out his phone. "Let me get your number, Rick. I'll text you the details for tomorrow." As they exchanged contact information, Rick couldn't help but feel a sense of warmth despite the day's harrowing events. In the face of danger and fear, connections had been forged. Tomorrow would bring a chance to strengthen those bonds, to find comfort in shared experience and mutual support. With final goodbyes and promises to meet the next day, the group finally parted ways. The Parkers followed an officer to a waiting police car, while the principal and school staff member headed to their own vehicle. Rick and Margaret made their way to their car, both feeling the weight of the day's events settling on their shoulders. As Rick started the engine and began to drive home, a comfortable silence fell over the car. The events of the day had left both him and Margaret drained, physically and emotionally. It was hard to believe that just this morning, their biggest concern had been a trip to Walmart for medication and groceries. Now, as the clock on the dashboard blinked 8 p.m., it felt as though days had passed since that moment in the store. Rick glanced over at Margaret, noticing the lines of fatigue etched on her face. "How's your knee doing, dear?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Margaret chuckled softly, a sound that warmed Rick's heart. You know, with all the adrenaline today, it surprisingly doesn't hurt much. Maybe we need this kind of excitement more often, she joked. Rick couldn't help but laugh, the tension of the day easing slightly. Be careful what you wish for, he teased back. Then with a start he realized, we never even got to do our grocery shopping, did we? Margaret waved her hand dismissively. Don't worry about it. We can always go back to Walmart tomorrow after lunch with the Parkers. The rest of the drive passed quickly, the familiar streets of Laredo sliding by outside the windows. When they finally pulled into their garage, both Rick and Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Home had never looked so inviting. They went through their bedtime routine on autopilot, the familiar rituals providing a comforting sense of normalcy after such an extraordinary day. As they finally lay down in bed, exhaustion took over, and they fell into a deep sleep almost instantly. The next time Rick opened his eyes, sunlight was streaming through the curtains. He blinked, disoriented for a moment, then turned to look at the clock. His eyes widened in surprise. It was 10:30 a.m. Beside him, Margaret was still fast asleep. Gently, he shook her awake. Margaret, honey, wake up. You won't believe what time it is. Margaret stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw the time, she let out a laugh. My goodness, we slept like teenagers. I can't remember the last time we slept this late. Rick chuckled, reaching for his phone on the nightstand. He saw a text from Roy Parker sharing the exact location of La Contessa apartment and their unit number. We'd better start getting ready, he said, showing Margaret the message. We don't want to be late for lunch. They got up and began to prepare for the day, moving with a bit more pep in their step than usual. The long sleep had done them good, refreshing them after yesterday's ordeal. As they got dressed and had a quick breakfast, they discussed the events of the previous day, still marveling at how differently things could have turned out if Rick hadn't trusted his instincts. At 11:30 a.m. they were ready to leave. As Rick started the car, Margaret suddenly said, We can't go empty-handed. Let's stop at a gas station and pick up something to bring. Rick nodded in agreement, quickly finding a nearby gas station on the GPS. As he pulled into the station, Margaret said, I'll run in and grab something. You stay here. Rick frowned slightly. Are you sure? How's your knee? Margaret smiled reassuringly. It's fine, dear. The medication is working well today. I'll just be a minute. As Margaret got out of the car and walked towards the store, Rick watched her go, a mixture of love and concern in his eyes. Even after all these years, her strength and resilience never ceased to amaze him. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly on the gas station parking lot. The heat shimmered off the asphalt, creating a mirage-like effect that made the world seem slightly out of focus. She could feel the warmth seeping through the soles of her shoes as she made her way towards the convenience store, her steps measured and deliberate to avoid putting too much strain on her arthritic knee. As she approached the store entrance, the acrid smell of cigarette smoke wafted towards her. Margaret's eyes were drawn to its source, a Latino man leaning against the wall just outside the door. He was dressed in worn jeans and a faded t-shirt, a cigarette dangling loosely from his fingers. Something about his posture, the way his eyes darted around, sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. Unbidden, images of Carlos Ortiz from yesterday flashed through her mind. The resemblance wasn't strong, but it was enough to make her heart rate quicken. She tried to push the thoughts away, reminding herself that not every stranger was a threat, but the unease lingered like a persistent shadow. The man's gaze locked onto her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you looking at, lady?" he asked, his voice gruff and challenging. Margaret quickly averted her eyes, feeling a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. She hurried into the store, the cool air inside a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she made her way to the coolers at the back, the sound mixing with the soft beeping of the cash register and the murmur of other customers. She selected a few bottles of soda, the glass cool against her palms. As she stood in line to pay, Margaret found her gaze drawn back to the window, where she could still see the man smoking outside. He hadn't moved, his presence a constant reminder of her unease. The cashier's voice startled her out of her thoughts. "Will that be all, ma'am?" Margaret nodded, fumbling with her purse as she paid. Her fingers trembled slightly as she gathered her change and the plastic bag containing the sodas. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the walk back to the car. As she stepped outside, the heat enveloped her once again. The man was still there, his eyes following her as she walked past. "Lovely bag, Granny. Where you going? Got any grandkids?" he called out suddenly, his tone casual but with an undercurrent that made Margaret's skin crawl. She didn't respond, keeping her gaze fixed straight ahead as she quickened her pace, clutching her bag tightly against her chest. The weight of the man's stare felt almost tangible, pressing against her back with an unsettling force. Every instinct urged her to run, but she forced herself to maintain. When she finally reached the car, Margaret's hands shook as she opened the door. She practically fell into the seat, her heart pounding in her chest. Rick's concerned voice cut through the fog of her anxiety. "What is it?" he asked, his brow furrowed as he took in her worried expression. Margaret shook her head, trying to gather her thoughts. "It's nothing," she said, aiming for a casual tone but missing by a mile. "I think yesterday's events have affected me more than I realized." Rick's gaze shifted to the store entrance, where the man was still standing, stubbing out his cigarette with his foot. "You mean that man smoking over there?" Margaret nodded, feeling a mix of relief that Rick understood and embarrassment at her own reaction. "Yes, I know it's silly, but I just felt uneasy." Rick watched the man for a long moment, his jaw set in a hard line. His eyes met the stranger's briefly through the car's window, an unspoken challenge passing between them. Then, without a word, he put the car in reverse. "This area isn't the safest," he said as they pulled out of the gas station, his voice low and reassuring. "You were right to be cautious, but don't worry about it now, okay?" As they drove towards La Contessa apartment, Margaret tried to shake off her unease. The rational part of her mind knew she was overreacting, but after yesterday's events, it was hard not to see potential danger lurking around every corner. She focused on the passing scenery, the familiar streets of Laredo sliding by outside the window, trying to ground herself in the normalcy of their surroundings. Just as they were nearing their destination, Rick's voice broke the silence. "Look," he said, pointing to a car ahead of them. "That car has a Martin School sticker on the rear window." Margaret leaned forward, squinting to see the sticker more clearly. "I don't remember the Parkers inviting the principal to lunch," she mused, her earlier unease momentarily forgotten. "Do you think it could be a teacher or a friend?" As they pulled into the parking lot of La Contessa, the car with the school sticker came to a stop nearby. They watched as the driver stepped out, and to their surprise, it was the same male school staff member who had been with the principal at the police station yesterday. They all converged at the entrance to the building, exchanging greetings. The staff member introduced herself as Triana, her voice friendly but professional. "I'm just delivering some school materials for Chloe," she explained. "The parents requested them this morning." As they approached the glass doors of the lobby, Margaret found herself glancing over her shoulder, a habit she'd picked up from years of being married to a cautious ex-military man. Her heart nearly stopped as she caught sight of a familiar figure, a man on a bike passing through the car parking lot towards the motorbike parking area. Even from this distance, she could swear it was the same man from the gas station. She blinked hard, trying to clear her vision. Was she just imagining things? The stress and tension must be getting to her. Even if it was the same man, what did it matter? He could be meeting someone here or have business of his own. Margaret tried to shake off her paranoia, but a nagging feeling of unease persisted as they entered the building, the cool air of the lobby doing little to calm her racing thoughts. They made their way through the lush, manicured grounds of La Contessa, the afternoon sun filtering through the leaves of palm trees that lined the path. The air was heavy with the scent of chlorine from the nearby pool, mixed with the sweet fragrance of tropical flowers that adorned the landscaping. As they approached the Parkers' ground-floor apartment, Margaret couldn't help but marvel at the luxury of the complex. The building itself was an impressive sight, its modern architecture blending seamlessly with the natural surroundings. Large glass doors and windows reflected the shimmering water of the pool, creating an illusion of endless blue. They reached the apartment unit. its location providing direct access to the main pool area. Rick raised his hand to the doorbell, its soft chime barely audible over the gentle lapping of water against the pool's edge. Moments passed, filled only with the distant chirping of birds and the faint rustling of leaves in the warm breeze. Finally, the door swung open, revealing Roy Parker. His face, though warm and welcoming, still bore traces of the stress from the previous day's events. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying a mix of gratitude and lingering concern. "Please come in." As they stepped inside, the cool air of the apartment washed over them, a welcome respite from the Texas heat. The interior was spacious and elegantly furnished, with large windows offering an unobstructed view of the pool area. Triana, the school staff member, spoke up as they settled in. "I'm just dropping off these materials," he explained, gesturing to the bag he carried. "I'll head back after, but I need to speak with Chloe briefly to explain some of the homework." Roy nodded, his gaze drifting to the inviting pool area just beyond the glass doors. "You know what?" he suggested, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Why don't you do it out there?" He pointed to a table with a shade umbrella near the pool. "It's better than being cooped up inside on such a nice day." Rick called out for Chloe, his voice echoing slightly in the apartment. A moment later, the young girl appeared from one of the bedrooms. Her blonde hair was slightly tousled, and her eyes, though bright, still held a hint of the fear she'd experienced the day before. She clutched her backpack tightly to her chest, as if it were a protective shield. "Hi, Mr. Rick, Mrs. Margaret," Chloe said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced at Triana, a flicker of recognition passing across her face. Roy gently ushered Chloe towards Triana. "Sweetheart, Mrs. Triana is going to explain some schoolwork to you. Why don't you two sit by the pool? It's a beautiful day out there." Chloe nodded, her grip on her backpack loosening slightly. She followed Triana out through the glass doors, the warm air rushing in as they stepped outside. Margaret watched as they made their way to the table, noting how the pool area was empty and quiet, devoid of other guests in the low tourist season. As Roy closed the door behind them, he turned back to Rick and Margaret. "Can I offer you something to drink? We have some cold beverages in the fridge." Rick smiled, holding up the bag they'd brought. "Actually, we picked up some sodas on the way. Thought you might need them." Roy's face lit up with gratitude. "That's very thoughtful of you. Thank you." He took the bag and headed towards the kitchen area. As he put the drinks away, he called over his shoulder, "You know, we actually need to go to Walmart to buy some necessities and groceries. We came here without anything last night, and we're lacking toiletries and food for the next few days." He turned back to face them, a slightly sheepish expression on his face. "I hate to ask, but would you mind if we drive together? Margaret and Evelyn can stay here with Chloe." Rick and Margaret exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. After a moment, Rick nodded. "Of course, that's no problem at all. I'd be happy to go with you." Margaret smiled reassuringly. "I'll stay here with Evelyn and Chloe. It'll give us a chance to chat and relax a bit." Just then, Evelyn emerged from one of the bedrooms, her face brightening as she saw their guests. "Margaret, Rick, I'm so glad you could make it," she said warmly. She turned to Margaret, gesturing towards the living area. "Why don't we sit down? I can show you the room service menu if you'd like to order something for when the men get back." As Rick prepared to leave with Roy, Margaret sank into the plush outdoor chair beside Evelyn on the porch, which overlooked the pool and Chloe's table. Her gaze drifted toward the pool area, where Chloe and Triana sat deep in conversation over their schoolwork. The sun danced off the water's surface, casting shimmering reflections that felt almost too bright, too peaceful, for the unease still lingering in the air. Margaret turned back to Evelyn, forcing a smile. "The room service sounds lovely, but why don't we wait until later? For now, I'd love to hear more about you and Chloe." As the two women began to talk, their voices blending into the quiet of the apartment, their chat meandered through various topics, but it always coming back to the recent ordeal that had brought them together. Evelyn's voice occasionally trembled when she spoke of the previous day's events, her eyes darting to the pool area where Chloe sat with Triana. The lush greenery surrounding their room and the pool area had been meant to provide a sense of security. Yet to Margaret, it now felt constricting. As they talked, the unease that had settled in her chest since the gas station refused to fade. No matter how hard she tried to stay engaged, her gaze kept drifting to Chloe and Triana, engrossed in their schoolwork. The scene looked peaceful, almost idyllic, but her instincts remained sharp. A small part of her couldn't help but wonder, had she really seen the man from the gas station in the parking lot, or was her mind playing tricks on her? Suddenly, as if struck by lightning, someone emerged from the bushes, and a sharp knock to the back of Evelyn's neck shattered the peaceful atmosphere. Margaret turned just in time to see Evelyn slump forward, her eyes rolling back as she lost consciousness. Before Margaret could process what was happening, a masked man appeared behind her, his presence sending a jolt of terror coursing through her body. Margaret's instinct was to scream for help, but the words caught in her throat as the man pulled a flip knife from his pocket. She couldn't see the face behind the mask, but she clearly recognized the pale shirt of the man from the gas station. "Make a sound," he growled, his voice low and menacing, "and I'll have to use this. You don't want that, do you?" Heart pounding, Margaret's eyes darted to the pool area, seeking help. What she saw made her blood run cold. Triana, far from being a concerned teacher, was now holding Chloe's hand and mouth tightly, moving to stand beside the masked man. The betrayal was written clearly on Chloe's terrified face. "Triana," Margaret gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" The masked man, his features hidden but his body language radiating tension, moved swiftly. Before Margaret could fully process what was happening, she felt a sharp pain at the base of her skull. The world tilted and blurred, consciousness slipping away like water through her fingers. As she faded into semi-consciousness, Margaret was vaguely aware of being moved. She felt the rough texture of carpet against her cheek, then the cool smoothness of tile. Muffled voices reached her ears, distorted as if coming from underwater. "I told you this is not the time," she heard Triana's voice, tinged with anxiety. "You're being impatient. Where are we going to hide in daylight?" The man's gruff voice replied, though Margaret could only catch fragments. "Not border, police, ransom." Through the haze of her fading consciousness, Margaret felt her body being moved again. The world around her grew darker, and she realized she was being hidden somewhere, under a bed, inside a closet perhaps. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her completely was Chloe's frightened voice. "Let me go." Then silence. An indeterminate amount of time passed before Margaret began to stir. Consciousness returned slowly, like a tide gradually creeping up a shoreline. The first thing she became aware of was the dull ache at the base of her skull, throbbing in time with her heartbeat. Then came the realization of her surroundings, the musty smell of dust, the hard surface beneath her, and the oppressive darkness that pressed in from all sides. As her mind cleared, the events leading up to her current situation came rushing back. The masked man, Triana's betrayal, Chloe's terrified face. It all hit her with the force of a physical blow. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but years of being married to a military man had taught Margaret the value of staying calm in crisis situations. She tried to move, only to find her arms and legs bound tightly. The coarse rope bit into her skin as she struggled, and she could taste the bitter adhesive of the tape across her mouth. Despite the bindings, Margaret forced herself to take deep, measured breaths through her nose, fighting back the claustrophobia that threatened to engulf her. Straining her ears, Margaret listened for any sounds that might give her a clue about her surroundings or the whereabouts of Evelyn and Chloe. But all she could hear was the muffled hum of the air conditioning and the occasional distant sound of a car passing outside. Time seemed to stretch endlessly in the darkness. Margaret's joints ached from the cramped position, the pain in her arthritic knee particularly sharp. She tried to focus on loosening the bonds on her wrists, rubbing them against the rough carpet beneath her in an attempt to create some slack. As she worked, Margaret's mind raced. Where were Rick and Roy? Had they returned from their shopping trip yet? And what about Evelyn and Chloe? Were they nearby, similarly bound and hidden? The not knowing was almost worse than the physical discomfort. Just when despair threatened to overtake her, Margaret heard the faint sound of a door opening. Voices drifted to her, too muffled to make out words, but unmistakably male. Her heart leapt. Could it be Rick and Roy returning? Gathering all her strength, Margaret began to make as much noise as she could. She thumped her bound feet against the floor and tried to shout through the gag. The sounds she produced were pathetically faint to her own ears, but she persisted, driven by desperation and hope. To her immense relief, she heard footsteps approaching, then Rick's voice, tense with worry. "Margaret." "Where are you?" With renewed vigor, Margaret called out again. This time, her muffled cries were heard. "She's under the bed." Roy's voice came, filled with a mixture of relief and panic. Suddenly, light flooded Margaret's vision as the bed above her was moved. Squinting against the sudden brightness, she saw Rick's face appear, his features etched with concern and fear. "Oh, Margaret," he breathed, quickly moving to untie her bonds. His hands shook slightly as he worked, a rare display of vulnerability from her usually stoic husband. As soon as the gag was removed, Margaret gasped out, "Evelyn!" "Chloe." Roy, who had been helping Rick, froze at her words. "What do you mean?" "Aren't they here?" Margaret shook her head, wincing at the movement. "Triana, she was working with them. A man in a mask, and they took Chloe. Evelyn was knocked out. I don't know where they are." The colour drained from Roy's face as the implications of Margaret's words hit him. He stood abruptly, rushing outside and calling for his wife and daughter, his voice becoming increasingly frantic with each unanswered call. Rick helped Margaret to her feet, supporting her as her stiff limbs protested the movement. "What happened?" he asked gently, his arm around her waist. Margaret recounted the events as best she could, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. When she finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. Suddenly, Roy's voice cut through the tension. "There's a note," he said, his voice tight with fear. He held up a piece of paper that had been tucked into Margaret's shoe. "It's a ransom demand." Rick took the note, reading it aloud. 100,000, no police or the girl and wife gone. His voice was grim as he finished. Roy sank into a nearby chair, his face pale with shock. After a moment of stunned silence, he looked up, his eyes filled with a bitter realization. "Now it all makes sense," he said, his voice tight with anger. "This wasn't a normal kidnapping. They deliberately targeted Chloe because they know we have money. That man yesterday, Otis, this can't be a coincidence. These people must be his accomplices." Roy's face was a mask of anguish. "What do we do? Should we call the police?" Rick hesitated, years of military training clashing with his instinct to involve the authorities. "We should," he said slowly. "But we need to be cautious. These people appear to have inside information. Triana was at the police station last night when we discussed staying in this apartment. She had no idea about the lunch, right? She was already on her way to their vehicle with the principal." Margaret spoke up, her voice hoarse but resolute. "I heard them talking before I lost consciousness. The man, not Triana, mentioned something about not going to the border because of the police. And Triana, he said the man was getting impatient." Margaret added, "That man was the one we saw at the gas station. I recognized his clothes even though he was wearing a mask." Rick's brow furrowed in thought. That could be important. It sounds like they're not as organized as they want us to think. "Roy, I think you should call the police, but ask for an undercover investigation. We don't want to spook these people, but we need help." Roy nodded, his hands shaking as he reached for his phone. "I'll call them right away. And the school, we need to find out more about Triana." As Roy made the calls, Rick turned to Margaret, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern. "Are you all right? Do you need anything?" Margaret managed a weak smile. "I'm okay, just, could you get my purse? I need my medication." Rick nodded, moving to search for her bag, but after a few moments of fruitless looking, he returned, his face grim. "I can't find it. I think they must have taken it." Margaret's heart sank at the realization. She recalled how the man had made a comment about her bag earlier at the gas station. She felt violated, The thought of her medication and everything else in her purse being in the hands of these criminals was deeply unsettling. As Roy finished his phone calls, the three of them gathered in the living room, the cheerful decor now seeming mockingly out of place given the gravity of their situation. They sat in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts, waiting for the police to arrive and praying that Evelyn and Chloe were safe. The waiting was excruciating, each minute stretching out endlessly. But beneath the fear and worry, a steely determination was forming. They had faced danger before and come out on top. Somehow they would do it again. They had to, for Evelyn and Chloe's sake. The tension in the apartment was palpable as Rick, Margaret and Roy waited for news. The ticking of a nearby clock seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence, each second a painful reminder of the time slipping away. Roy paced restlessly, his eyes constantly darting to his phone, willing it to ring with news of his wife and daughter. Rick sat beside Margaret on the couch, his arm protectively around her shoulders. Despite the calm exterior he was trying to maintain, Margaret could feel the tension in his body, coiled like a spring, ready to snap into action at a moment's notice. Suddenly Roy's phone buzzed to life, the sound startling in the quiet room. Roy snatched it up, his hands shaking slightly as he answered. "Hello? Yes, this is Roy Parker." Rick and Margaret watched intently as Roy listened, his expression shifting from hope to confusion to disappointment. "I see," he said finally, his voice heavy. "Thank you for the update. Please keep us informed of any developments." As he ended the call, Roy turned to Rick and Margaret, his face a mask of frustration. "That was the police. They've put out an APB on Triana and are monitoring all major roads and the border crossing. But so far there's no sign of them." Rick leaned forward, his brow furrowed in thought. Suddenly an idea struck. What about tracking Evelyn's phone? If they took her purse like they did with Margaret's, her phone might still be with them. Unfortunately, Margaret's phone is too old for all that new technology. Roy's eyes widened, a glimmer of hope sparking in them. Of course. Why didn't I think of that? He quickly pulled up an app on his phone, his fingers flying over the screen. After a tense moment, he let out a small gasp. "I've got it. They're moving. They're about 40 minutes away from Laredo, heading towards Oilton." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, the lethargy of waiting replaced by a surge of nervous energy. Rick stood up, his military training evident in his decisive movements. "We need to relay this information to the police immediately. Every second counts." As Roy made the call, updating the police on the new information and sharing access to the tracking app, Rick turned to Margaret. His face was set with determination, but his eyes were soft with concern. "Margaret, I think we need to go after them, but I understand if you'd rather stay here after what you've been through." Margaret cut him off, her voice firm despite her lingering fear. "I'm coming with you, Rick. You can't leave me here. What if... And I can't just sit here and wait. Not when Evelyn and Chloe are in danger." Rick nodded, a small smile of pride crossing his face. "All right then, let's get ready to move." Roy ended his call with the police, his face reflecting a mix of hope and anxiety. They're reaching out to units in the Oilton area to intercept. They've also sent teams here to review the apartment's security footage. We should head out, and the police will be at Route 359 toward Oilton. They advised against traveling in convoy to avoid drawing attention since we don't know how many of them there are. "Good," Rick said, already moving towards the door. "We need to get on the road now. We can't afford to wait for the escort. Every minute counts." The three of them hurried out of the apartment, pausing only long enough to inform the front desk of the situation and request that they cooperate fully with the police. As they rushed to the parking lot, the Texas heat hit them like a wall, but none of them noticed, their minds focused solely on the rescue mission ahead. They piled into Rick's car, Roy in the front passenger seat with his phone out, monitoring the tracking app. As Rick started the engine, Margaret couldn't help but think of the last time they had been in this car, heading to what they thought would be a pleasant lunch with new friends. How quickly things had changed. As they pulled out of the parking lot, the clock on the car's display read 3 p.m. The familiar streets of Laredo gradually gave way to more rural surroundings as they made their way toward Oilton, the scenery flashing by in a blur of vibrant afternoon colors. Moments stretched into an uneasy silence as Rick focused intently on the road, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. Beside him, Roy was glued to his phone, the tracking app illuminating his face in the dim light of the car. The steady hum of the engine filled the space between them as they barreled down Route 359, the landscape slipping by in a blur of dusty browns and muted greens. After 20 tense minutes, Roy suddenly broke the silence, his voice barely concealing the urgency. "The kidnapper's car has stopped," he said, glancing up with a mix of hope and apprehension. They exchanged glances, weighing the implications. Did this mean the police had caught up? The lack of updates from law enforcement gnawed at them. Rick's eyes flicked to the GPS, which displayed their progress toward the pinpoint on the map. As they drew closer, the road remained eerily quiet. No signs of police presence, road closures, or diversions greeted them. The atmosphere outside felt heavy, as if the world were holding its breath. When they finally reached the marked point, their hearts sank as they noticed the dot had halted at what appeared to be an abandoned school building, its weathered facade crumbling in the sun. Rick parked the car in a clearing a safe distance from the building, his mind racing with possibilities. They dialed the police again, their frustration bubbling to the surface. "Where are you?" Roy demanded into the phone. "We're on Route 359 between Aguilares and Oilton, and we see an abandoned school building. There's no police here." Rick could hear muffled voices from the other end of the line, providing a lengthy explanation. They urged him to wait a little longer, assuring him that the teams were on their way and would arrive in less than 20 minutes. After hanging up, Roy's expression hardened with determination. "I need to check it out," he said, opening the car door. "The kidnapper will want to see me anyway. They won't hurt me because they need my money." Rick's heart raced. "You can't go in there alone. It's dangerous," he protested, but Roy was already stepping out, his mind made up. Just then, a chilling scream echoed from within the dilapidated building, slicing through the stillness. Without a moment's hesitation, Roy dashed toward the entrance, leaving Rick in a whirlwind of anxiety. "Margaret, stay in the car and lock the doors," Rick shouted, his voice urgent. "Call the police again if they don't arrive in 15 minutes. He glanced back to see her wide-eyed and trembling, but nodded in understanding. He kept the engine running, a comforting hum in the chaos, and quickly made sure the doors were locked before sprinting after Roy, who had already vanished into the shadows of the school. Rick's heart raced as he cautiously navigated the abandoned school building, his eyes scanning for any sign of Roy. The musty scent of decay lingered in the air, and an unsettling silence enveloped him, broken only by the sound of their muffled footsteps and the occasional creak of the aging structure settling. Years of military training heightened his awareness, sharpening his instincts to a fine edge. Each echoing sound made him tense, and he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him as every fiber of his being remained on high alert. As he climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, Rick's mind raced with possibilities. He prayed they weren't too late, that Evelyn and Chloe were unharmed. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, not just for the Parker family, but for Margaret waiting anxiously in the car outside. As Rick reached the 3rd floor, he spotted Roy ahead. Roy raised a hand, signaling him to stop. Straining his ears, Rick listened intently for any signs of life. Then faintly he heard it, muffled voices drifting from down the hall. The sound sent a shiver down his spine, heightening his sense of urgency as he moved cautiously forward. "This way," Roy whispered, gesturing for Rick to follow. They crept down the corridor, passing empty classrooms with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. The voices grew louder as they approached a room near the end of the hall. Light spilled out from under the closed door. Rick pressed his ear against the wood, listening intently. He could make out Evelyn's soft sobs and Chloe's frightened whimpers. Relief flooded through him. They were alive. But then he heard another voice, cold and threatening. "We're secure here," the man was saying. "We can send him a message of our location for the ransom." Rick's blood ran cold. He turned to Roy, whose face had gone pale. "We need to wait for police," Rick mouthed silently. We know where they are. We should go back. Roy shook his head, his jaw clenched with determination. Rick could see the hatred and fury burning in his eyes, emotions that seemed to cloud his judgment and drown out any rational thoughts. As Rick and Roy lingered in the corridor, whispering and hesitating, their quiet conversation didn't go unnoticed. Suddenly the door swung open, catching them off guard. Triana and the man stood framed in the doorway, their eyes wide with a mix of shock and apprehension. The atmosphere crackled with unspoken tension as both sides realized the precarious situation they were in, caught in a moment that could shift in an instant. The man quickly lunged forward, grabbing Rick and Roy and yanking them into the room. His hands moved rapidly, searching them for weapons with a sense of urgency. Rick felt the man's fingers probe against his sides, and he tensed, instinctively ready to fight back, while Roy stood frozen in shock. Triana watched, her expression a hint of anxiety and determination, unsure of how the situation would unfold. "Well, well," Triana sneered. "Looks like we have some heroes, Miguel." Then she turned to Rick and Roy. "We haven't texted you our location. How did you find us?" Triana asked. "That's not important," Roy said. "Release my wife and my daughter." "And do you have our money?" the woman in ponytail asked. "I don't have the money," Roy replied, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Miguel laughed, a cold, harsh sound that echoed through the empty room. "You're brave to come here empty-handed," he sneered, "but you're wasting time." His eyes narrowed as he took a step closer to Roy. "Because of you people, Ortiz is sitting in prison right now. We know exactly how wealthy you are." His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "So don't try to tell us you don't have the money. You shouldn't have come here. Now nobody wins," Triana added. Rick shot back. "The police are already on their way and you have no escape." "You should surrender. This isn't smart." He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the stakes higher than ever. They had tracked them using the stolen phone, and he hoped to appeal to whatever sense of reason might be left in Miguel. Triana glared at Miguel, her face contorted with hatred. "Worse than Ortiz, you stupid dog, I warned you," she whispered, her tone dripping with venom. Miguel responded with contempt, suggesting it was better to resolve the situation here and make their escape. Undeterred, Triana fired back. "We should have done this at night, not during the day, you idiot. You just can't control your instincts. I had it all planned out." The insult ignited something within Miguel. With a flick of his wrist, he pulled out his flip knife and gun, marching toward Evelyn and Chloe with a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Like you said, boss, no one wins today," he said, the gun's safety clicking off as he aimed it at Chloe. "Stop, don't do that," Rick and Roy shouted in unison, panic surging through them. But before they could intervene, the sound of multiple gunshots rang out, sharp and deafening. Roy and Rick instinctively closed their eyes and covered their ears, shock coursing through their veins. "No, no, no, no," Roy cried out, his heart racing as dread filled him. But then, through the haze of confusion, they opened their eyes to a scene they could scarcely believe. Miguel had shot Triana in the chest, her body collapsing to the ground as he staggered backward, a look of pain etched across his face. Behind them, the police emerged, having intercepted just in time. They had shot Miguel in the shoulder, and the bullet had narrowly missed his chest. Triana lay motionless on the floor while Miguel groaned in agony, the reality of their situation crashing down around them. Roy rushed to Evelyn and Chloe, his heart pounding as he checked them over for injuries. Relief flooded through him as he realized they were unharmed, though Chloe's eyes were wide with shock, her body trembling. The moment was surreal, a chaotic blend of fear and relief as they grasped the gravity of what had just unfolded. A group of police rushed in, their radios crackling as they called for 2 paramedic backup. The air was tense as officers quickly assessed the scene, ensuring Evelyn and Chloe were safely escorted out of the building. Rick stood at the doorway, watching as the police began photographing the area, documenting the aftermath of the chaos. Once outside, the blaring sirens of an ambulance filled the air, and the paramedic team hurried inside the school, guided by an officer. Another team approached Evelyn and Chloe, their faces a mix of urgency and compassion. Chloe sat on a stretcher, wrapped in a shock blanket, her eyes wide and empty, filled with fear. Evelyn remained close by, her presence a comforting anchor amid the turmoil. Margaret stepped out of the car, her heart racing, and joined Rick and the Parker family near the ambulance, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, a blend of gratitude and lingering fear. An officer approached, and Roy immediately expressed his frustration, questioning how the police could arrive later than them, despite their call 50 minutes earlier. The officer, the same one who had managed their case in Laredo, clarified, "The Oilton Police Department has limited personnel, and it took approximately 20 minutes to reach here from the city. I understand this may sound like excuses, but we're doing the best we can, and sir, you should have stayed in your vehicle to prevent the situation from escalating like this." Roy nodded, the relief of having his family safe overshadowing his irritation and guilt. "I thought I'd lost both of them when I heard the gunshots," he admitted, his voice shaking slightly. The officer confirmed that Miguel was the one who shot Triana, but they wouldn't know the motives until after the interrogation at the station. Rick speculated, it was likely that insult Triana hurled at him. He must have been fed up with her, especially realizing they wouldn't gain anything from this situation. Margaret chimed in, recalling fragments of their conversation. "I heard Triana say something about him being impatient. I think there was some miscommunication between them. Triana believed that kidnapping the child right after Otis was caught was a mistake." Their eyes shifted back to the school as 2 stretchers were carried out. One was fully covered, and they all knew it was Triana's body. The other stretcher bore Miguel, who was handcuffed and grimacing in pain. As he was loaded into the ambulance, he caught sight of Rick, Roy, and the others. "You're lucky I hate her," he sneered, gesturing as if to mimic a gunshot with his hand. The ambulance doors closed with a finality that sent a chill through the group, and it sped away, leaving just one ambulance behind for Chloe and Evelyn. The air was thick with a mix of relief and grief, each of them grappling with the events that had just unfolded. The remaining paramedic team carefully assessed Evelyn and Chloe, their professionalism a comforting presence in the midst of chaos. After a thorough examination, one of the paramedics, a tall man with kind eyes, smiled softly at them. "You both are okay," he confirmed, his voice calm and steady. "No major injuries, just some bruises and minor cuts." He turned to Evelyn, who still looked dazed from the blow to her head earlier. "You might feel a bit off for a while, but it's important to keep an eye on any symptoms. If anything feels unusual, don't hesitate to call for a hospital visit." Chloe, sitting on the stretcher, clutched her arms around her knees, her wide eyes reflecting the shock of what had just occurred. The paramedic crouched down to her level, speaking gently. "You did a really brave thing today, and it's normal to feel scared after everything that's happened. If you're feeling overwhelmed, it might be a good idea to talk to someone, like a child therapist. They can help you process everything." Chloe nodded slowly, absorbing his words, though the fear still lingered in her gaze. Evelyn watched the exchange, grateful for the paramedic's kindness. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I think we both might need that help." The paramedic nodded understandingly, assuring them that it was perfectly okay to seek support after such a traumatic experience. Roy approached, and he hugged his wife and Chloe tightly. "We should seriously consider leaving Laredo," he said, his voice filled with concern. "We're not safe here. The fact that school staff were involved in all of this shows how insecure this place is for our family, especially given our wealth." Evelyn nodded in agreement, her expression solemn. As they spoke, an officer approached, explaining that they would be investigating the school further and that the principal had been taken to the police department in Laredo for questioning. "I hate to say this again after the event yesterday, but we need all of you to come down to the station right away to give your witness statements," he instructed. Rick felt a knot tighten in his stomach at the thought of the chaotic events still fresh in their minds. Concerned about Margaret's pain, knowing she was likely in discomfort after the ordeal, Rick reached out to the officer. He asked the officer if he could retrieve the arthritis medication from his wife's bag, saying it was taken by Rick and Triana from the apartment. The officer nodded without hesitation, retrieving the cream from her bag from the nearby forensic officer and handing it to Rick. He quickly passed it to Margaret, who accepted it gratefully. It was the same ones they had purchased from Walmart just the day before. As the scene unfolded, the Parker family climbed into the police car, a mix of gratitude and exhaustion in their expressions. Margaret and Rick got into their own vehicle, and as Rick started the engine, Margaret sighed. "This feels like déjà vu," she said, reflecting on the whirlwind of events. "I regret what I said last night about how adrenaline was good for my joints." "You were right, we need to call off that prayer." Rick smiled, watching Margaret applying her medication. Then when she's done, he asked, "Are you ready to go?" He asked, his gaze steady and unwavering on the road ahead, a testament to his resolve in protecting his family. When she confirmed, he began to drive, the tension of the day slowly easing as they put distance between themselves and the chaos they had just escaped. As they pulled away from the scene, Margaret glanced back at the school, a bittersweet ache settling in her heart. The abandoned building loomed behind them, a stark reminder of the turmoil they had faced. Yet amidst the chaos, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for their family's safety and the strength they had shown in adversity. Today had been harrowing, but it also served as a powerful reminder of the resilience that bound them together. With every mile they put between themselves and the nightmare, the warmth of family love enveloped them. They had faced darkness and emerged into the light hand in hand. Margaret squeezed Rick's hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey.